Peter Pattakos from ClevelandFrowns.com. Good site. Follow them on Twitter as well. He's currently researching a story now for Scene Magazine. Peter, how are you today?
Hey, Andy, I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
No worries. Thanks for coming on. This is a hot-button topic for you right now because you're writing the story. Are we missing some points when it comes to, is Chief Wahoo offensive? Is the Cleveland Indians name offensive? Are we missing something here?
I do believe you're missing a few big points here.
Okay.
And first I want to be clear that I want to focus just on the Wahoo issue.
Okay.
I think the Indians name itself could at least conceivably at least honor Indians and could conceivably honor Native Americans. We have a rich tradition of a rich Native American history here, especially in Ohio. Cuyahoga is a native word,
sure,
which is just the tip of the iceberg here. I'd like to focus specifically on Wahoo.
Okay, what's your research telling you about this?
Wahoo is much more likely to be changed. The idea that they would change the team name it's much more likely that Wahoo's going to go. So if these activists are going to have any success at all, I would say they're much more likely to have success with just getting rid of Wahoo, and we have seen how the team has phased Wahoo out. So
for the most part, they have. I agree with you. For the most part, they have.
And they'll even tell you that. I've spoken with Bob DiBiasio, who's the VP of Communications, who's basically the tribe's point man on this. And
right.
He won't come out and admit that it's wrong. He won't come out and say that it's wrong, but he will say he understands that it's offensive to some people and that they have phased it out. So for one, it's interesting that they point to that. But to this Sports Illustrated poll,
yes.
I don't believe that they actually showed Wahoo in that poll or that Wahoo has anything to do with that poll. I think that is talking about the native.
Do you know that, Peter, or are you guessing that?
I don't have it right. I don't have it down in front of me, but I remember reading it once before, and I'm looking at Wikipedia right now, and I believe that poll was very widely worded, and just talks about Indian names and mascots in general. I think Wahoo is something different, and this sort of gets to the biggest point that I think folks are missing here, which is that Wahoo is a Sambo caricature. And when I say a Sambo caricature, I mean this was drawn in the 1940s in a specific style that was directly intended to dehumanize another race. It was created by the majority culture to emphasize the otherness of another race. And that alone is why it needs to go.
Well, are you specifically talking about the logo that they used in the 40s and the 50s, or the one that came back in 51?
It's the one that they used in the 40s and 50s, and this one falls in the same category, unquestionably.
Okay. Well, it's essentially,
it doesn't look like an Indian. And one of the experts that I've spoken to on this.
Well, but if it doesn't look like an Indian, then again, if it doesn't look like an Indian, Peter, then it's a caricature, and it's made
it's very clearly intended to be a caricature of an Indian.
Correct.
Right. I mean,
there's no question.
I understand that there's an innocent attachment to Wahoo, and I think that's easy to understand. That a lot of us don't think of Indians at all, but that's not the point, right? The point is that some people do, especially the people of that culture.
I understand what you're saying. I'm actually just looking at the Chief Wahoos from over the years and where they are right now. And, if you look at the traditional one that they first used in 1921, you could say okay. And then if you look at the next one, through 1939, it looks like a very proud Native American who is, staring. I mean, it's not, you can look at that. And then they added the smile in 1940, and really that's where you go. And I understand.
That one is much worse, and that one looks like the caricatures of the Jews that Hitler would make, that you would see right in the in the Der Stürmer 1940s. That looks like it was taken right out of that, and I agree that one is actually much worse than the one we have now.
Sure,
but it's the same thing, and we're talking about an era where this type of cartoon drawing was popular in all major American animation houses as a way to reinforce Jim Crow laws. And it doesn't matter what race you're talking about. I mean, we're talking about a time period where the Indian Wars had just wrapped up. It's about reinforcing a dominant culture, and that's just what makes it wrong. No matter if people see it or not, that's quite clearly what it was intended to do. It's made in that style to make you think of Indians as something other than a human. I think that's the real argument against it.
Well, so my question for you then, Peter, is why disassociate the logo again then from the name? If you're going to go for it and you want to and you think it's wrong and it's the philosophy there, why wouldn't you go for the whole thing? Why wouldn't you just say the team name needs to end too?
Well, as I stated before, I think the team name could conceivably honor natives. So even if that wasn't the intent at the time, and I think if you look at the cartoons that were in the Plain Dealer on the day that they announced the name, I think it's very clear that it was not, the name was not intended to honor natives, but at least it conceivably could.
Well, there's the argument of
a
Lewis,
less drastic measure.
You know, but Peter, hang on one second. People will say that the team is named after Louis Alexis.
Yes, that's
to honor him.
That's demonstrably false.
Well, the Indians take pride in that. They say that that's what it's named after. I mean, it's in the media guide. There's pictures in the stadium.
It is, and I believe that's an embarrassment that the Indians. I believe that's a straight up lie. If you research Joe Poznanski, you know Joe Poznanski, the great sports writer, wrote for Sports Illustrated. He just moved over to USA Today.
Okay.
If you search Poznanski Chief Wahoo curse, you'll see an article where Poznanski basically blows the Sokolexis myth out of the water. In the story that I'm writing for Cleveland Scene, and I'll get into it more, but that's actually demonstrably false. It was a story that they made up after the fact.
Okay.
So, Peter, what would you suggest? What would you suggest the Indians do? And I mean the Cleveland Indians, the baseball team.
Just get rid of Wahoo. You don't have to make a big deal of it. Just next year, no more Wahoo. And don't you think it's interesting that we're the only. It's really the only acceptable racial caricature in basically in the Western world. And it's funny that we are also the longest and worst suffering sports city in the Western world as well, you could say. I mean,
I understand what you're saying.
I like the idea
that's
of
more than a stretch, Peter.
That's
more than a stretch.
A little bit. All right, so when's your article coming out in Scene, Peter?
Well, hopefully it will be in next week's issue. If not, it will be shortly after that.
All right, Peter Pattakos, right? Is that your last name?
Yes, appreciate that.
Just want to make sure I got it right there. I don't want to offend anybody today. Let me tell you that. All right, any other point? Just before I let you go, I want to make sure you were able to say everything you wanted to say.
There was one other point,
sure.
And this got to what Mr. Phelps was saying, that, not just because there's not consensus among Native Americans, I think that the fact that the name Indians is different from Wahoo it sort of goes to that point. I can understand why Native Americans would like to have teams named after them. Well, Wahoo is something completely different, especially when you look at what it actually is. But there's also the other point that we're talking about a extreme minority here. I believe in the last census, natives were 1.5% of the population. So, you're not going to hear an outcry. And not only that, natives are generally a very, I don't know what the best word is here, but as a culture, reservations are sort of a mess now. And we're talking about not just a minority culture, but a relatively politically weak minority culture. So to say that you're not hearing enough of an outcry from them, I mean, people only have so much energy.
Well, let